presentation is made possible mostly from support by the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, also with support from the Foundation for Economic Justice, Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth Sharing Associates, and private donors. And basically, I want to turn it over to Nic Tideman. Nic is a professor at the University of Virginia Polytechnic and State University of Virginia. And take it away, Nic.
Okay. First, I'm going to find the screen to share with you. So I'm going to talk about assessment as a competitive game. Now, what I used, well, different button works this time. So last time we heard Ted talk about assessment done right, and I commented that it isn't always done right, that sometimes assessors are corrupt or incompetent. And there's also just the element of contestable judgment. Competent and honest assessors won't come up with exactly the same answer because there's just an element of uncertainty in assessments, and this leaves people somewhat dissatisfied. And so people have been asking from time to time whether there's some way to allow the market to do assessments. And there's a history of this. When I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I had a chapter on self-assessment. There's two forms of self-assessment. The first form can be called compulsory sale. You say what your property is worth, you pay a tax on the amount you say, and if anybody wants to buy it at that price, you've sold it. But some people find that too harsh, and they've offered an alternative that if you don't want to sell, you don't have to, and then you pay some kind of penalty for the difference between the price that you assessed it and the price at which you now refuse to sell it. So there is that less severe form of self-assessment. From the perspective of people who like land value taxation, self-assessment has the difficulty that you inevitably tax improvements as well as land. It's, I don't know of a feasible system of self-assessment of land alone. Both versions of self-assessment require owners to become experts on how much what the value of their property is. Most of us don't know most of the time what the value of our property is, and it would be something of a burden to have to figure it out all the time. Both forms of self-assessment invite risk-taking in the form of trying to get away with something. If you lower your assessment, maybe nobody will want it and you can pay a lower tax. And that temptation toward risk-taking, sort of tilt in the direction of people who find it easy to take risks, is somewhat unfortunate. Oh, I got my first point wrong. Both tax personal value. What I mean by that is if your property is worth $600,000 to you and $500,000 to anybody else, most people will feel they have to assess it at $600,000 rather than $500,000 to be safe. Whereas an assessor would assess it at $500,000 because that's what it's worth on the market. And so people who attach additional value to their property wind up paying relatively more taxes under a system of self-assessment. So there are several forms of competitive assessment. The first I call simple competitive assessment. Anybody can be an assessor. To be an assessor, you make bids on property. The highest bid is the assessment. The highest bidder gets, say, 1% of the assessment. And I would pay something to the second highest bidder too, because we need some second highest bidders around, because maybe the highest bidder won't be there when you want him. So owners can accept bids of the assessors. If a bid is accepted, several things can happen. The assessor might say, whoops, I don't really want your house at that price. How about buying it back from me? So the person might say, okay, you said it was worth $550,000. I'll take your $550,000 and then I'll buy it back from you for $525,000 or whatever. Or it could be that the sale will go through just as intended, a bid was made and accepted, or there could be an auction. The assessor can say, I don't really want it, let's put it up for auction, see how much we can get for it. And if we can't auction it for as much as I said it's worth, I'll make up the difference. But assessors would want to assess on lots of property, and they couldn't be expected to actually buy all the property they assessed on, it seems to me. So it would be appropriate for an assessor to say, well, I'm going to put bids on 500 properties, but I wouldn't want to buy more than 3 of them. After I've been called on to buy 3 of them, I'm dropping out and you'll have to rely on other people to be the assessor. And whenever somebody drops out who had been the highest assessor, the assessment goes to the next highest bidder, the actual highest bidder at that time. So that's simple competitive assessment. Its limitations are that buildings are taxed just like land. And again, personal value may be taxed. A competitive assessor might figure out who's really attached to their property and assess it more than similar property. Now, they could get snookered. Maybe somebody would pretend to have a high value of his property when he actually wants to sell it. So there's potential for a game there of who can outsmart who in the assessment process. Well, so I started thinking about how could I have a competitive assessment system for land alone? And I believe there is a way to do it. So this is a long description. So an assessor doesn't assess properties one at a time. He reports an offer to buy vacant land that might become vacant, as a mathematical function that specifies land value per square foot. As a function of location, with discounts for suboptimal size or shape, adjustment for the impact of street width, corner location, distance to a transit stop, whatever affects value in a systematic way. But if you want to be an assessor, you have to place a land value function on a relatively large piece of land, something like 16 square blocks. So that there will be some parcels in there that might possibly be ready for redevelopment. And the assessor would know that he's not likely to get a property with a lot of assessment, but he's constrained to offer a smooth function. And he's also, as in the previous system of competitive assessment, allowed to set a limit on how much he's willing to buy. Well, you'd have to have some control over the shape of the function. The competitive assessor could not be allowed to have a sudden spike just where there happened to be a very valuable building. That would be taxing the building. When the higher bidder stops buying, the assessment goes to the next highest bidder. There's still some danger of taxing buildings because you can't, well, the assessor would have an incentive to see if you could get away with putting a higher assessment on places with buildings, because they would be less likely to be offered. So we could get away with taxing them more without having to buy them. So you would have to have the administrative system keep some kind of check on the assessors that they weren't artificially raising values where there happen to be significant improvements. So it's a bit of a trick to make the system work. And the system that I've described doesn't deal well with land assembly. You could have somebody saying, well, I'll pay $1 million for 2 lots side by side, but I need 2 lots side by side. If you give me only 1 lot, well, that's only worth 300,000 to me. I need 2 side by side to be worth $1 million. So it seems to me that it's interesting to think about changing the competitive land assessment system into something that works for land assembly as well. So here's the land assembly game that deals with, here's the competitive assessment game that deals with land assembly. So there are 4 kinds of players. First, there are property owners. They own property, offered for sale if they want to, and they accept offers from developers if they want to. The developers make offers to buy property, accept offers to sell property, and they redevelop property. Then we have the demolition contractors. If somebody wants to abandon this property with a building on it and somebody else wants to buy it as vacant land, we need to figure out how much it costs to transfer the abandoned land into the vacant land that somebody wants. And then we have administrators. So we have a number of rules. First, we have to decide on the frequency of play. There have to be particular days when values represent offers. So I suppose it might be something like decision day is the first day of every quarter. Then you have to decide on a tax rate. Now, since I like the idea of taxing land, I have in mind a tax rate of 5% per month. So that means that the selling price of a piece of vacant land would be 20 months rent. And there's some mathematics that goes along with this that says that the share of rent that you get is the ratio of the tax rate to the sum of the tax rate and the interest rate. And so if you have an interest rate of 6% per year, that's 0.5% per month. And 5% is 10/11ths of 5.5%. So you'd get 10/11ths of the rent with a tax rate of 5% per month if the interest rate is 6%. So on decision day, property owners can offer prices for the property if they want to. They offer it in its current condition, but they don't have to if they don't want to. Demolition contractors report a price schedule for how much they will charge for demolishing property as a function of how tall it is, how wide it is, whether it's made out of bricks or concrete or wood, so that we can calculate how much it costs to demolish anything that a person wants to abandon. Then the developers report offers to buy vacant land. And this time, because they're not just assessors but developers, they specify value per square foot, and they specify how much more they're prepared to pay for larger sizes. So they might say that in the middle of the block, I'll pay $300,000 for a 50-foot lot, but I'll pay $1 million for a 100-foot lot. They can put in whatever discounts or extra value they want to for pieces of property of the size and shape that they're looking for. They have to put value on a relatively large size again, say something like 16 square blocks. And again, they are allowed to go back and say no more if some limit on how much they want to work with is exceeded. So the administrator takes all the offers by the developers and calculates the highest value that any developer places on any particular square foot under whatever combination of whatever size and shape gives it the greatest value. So there's no account taken of the particular sizes and shapes of property. The question is, what is this particular square foot worth when it's put into the piece of property that makes it most valuable? So this is dealing with the land assembly issue. Now, next, the administrator has to see if there are any discontinuities. If a developer brings his bid up to one side of the street and on the other side of the street suddenly the value is lower, the administrator would probably say, no, there's no reason for the value to drop off across the street like that. We'll have to smooth things out and lower the values to eliminate such cliffs. So after that, the preliminary tax bills are ready. Now the tax assessor looks at the offers of owners to sell. So if we have an owner whose property is assessed at $700,000, but he's prepared to sell it for $500,000, well, then if anybody wants it just as it is for $500,000, it's sold. But suppose the only reason it's worth $7,000 is because somebody is willing to pay $1.4 million for two lots side by side. Well, what that means is that both of his neighbors have property that is now worth $900,000. It started out worth $700,000, but if you could get the one beside it for $500,000, then the addition of one beside it makes two for $1.4 million, which is what is offered. So anybody who has offered to sell his property can get his assessment reduced to what he offers to sell it for, and the result is that all the other participants in what would be a land assembly see the value of their property go up because it's now worth more because of the possibility of getting this component lower. So you could have a number of successive rounds of some property coming down in value, another property rising in value. So the holdouts get their property raised higher and higher in price as the people who are willing to sell make their prices known. Okay, now we have to deal with the fact that the owner has a property in improved condition and the developer wants it vacant. So you have to take account of that by saying that the value of the property is what the owner is willing to sell it for plus the demolition cost. That's what it is worth as a contribution to the overall assembly. So once all these offers have been made, in addition to the compulsory offers where somebody has made an offer and somebody else has to accept the offer, you might have people saying, well, we're close to agreement. Why don't we see if we can get to agreement? So the people are free to accept offers that are made or bargain. You don't have to stick by what you said. You can say, oh, really, we're that close to something? Okay, I'll take it. And again, if a developer buys his quota of land and is not willing to buy more, assessed value goes down to the highest remaining offer. Tax bills go out. Whoever made the highest bid gets 1% of the taxes. The person who made the second highest bid gets 1/10 of 1% and as a backup in case we need him. Then we get to optimal play. So owners have a temptation to overvalue and also a temptation to undervalue. The temptation to overvalue comes from the possibility of getting a higher price from the developer. The temptation to undervalue comes from the possibility of getting a lower tax bill. And one of the things that I worked out in my doctoral dissertation was that these temptations cancel, and the owner has an incentive to report an exactly truthful price if and only if the tax rate is equal to the probability of selling the property at the owner's value. But the probability of sale is almost certainly going to be lower than the tax rate. So owners will generally be tempted to undervalue their property, but they will stop when their concern for risk overcomes their desire for further gain. Developers also have offsetting temptations. If they lower their bids, they might get property at a lower price. If they raise their bid, they could get a higher reward for having the high bid and having a higher probability for having the high bid. So you won't get exactly truthful reports from the developers either. And one would expect that there'll be enough demolition contractors that they will simply act competitively. So my conclusion is that it is possible to have a land tax based on competitive offers for land for redevelopment. Owners can be protected from overassessment by, one, the option to sell at prices that developers offer. Let's see what this means. Limiting taxable value. Oh, yes, they can offer to sell their property and thereby lower their taxes. And the administrator can require that the assessed value function not overvalue developed land relative to land that is ripe for redevelopment. And that is the end of my presentation.
Okay, Ted, see what comments you have on this and take it from there.
All right, I had an opportunity to do a spreadsheet using Nic's assumptions, and I can say that it did work out quite well. I made various assumptions about what would happen, and I came to some very positive conclusions about it. I'm going to do a presentation also that will kind of work on what Nic talked about and bring up some different factors. I need to get the screen sharing possibility here offered to me. Nick, is your screen sharing turned off?
Yeah, you should be able to share your screen now, Ted.
Well, I'm not for some reason. Oh, I see. Let me click on that. Okay, there it goes. So the topic that Nick had was a competitive assessment game. And I noticed the word game there because in essence, what he was talking about was more or less setting up a hypothetical thing. And in reality, we're dealing with people that would require maybe some different considerations. But it's towards an efficient mechanism for assessing the undeveloped value of land. And I'm going to give a few examples of what we could use to competitively come up with the undeveloped value of land. I guess in my first slide I'm going to show you here is get the opinions of the developers, the owners, the real estate agents, and the professionals, the assessors, get them to meet and give their opinions of the undeveloped value of land. I did this as an assessor, both when I was the assessor in Southfield, Michigan, and in Hartford, British Columbia. And it kind of gives validity to your thinking and what you're doing by actually getting people to sit down before you start applying assessments to kind of review them, get their opinions, and they challenge you on things. They talk about, well, the very best location is this one, and you should be downplaying other ones that are of a lesser location and value. In the next slide, it's important to realize the value of a land value residual. You all know that assessors typically add land value to building value to come up with a total property value. And it's simple. It's really simple math. It's algebra. If you know land and if you know buildings, you can come up with a total. Or if you know the building value or the land value and the total value, you can come up with a building value. And what I'm showing you is a land value residual, because while as assessors, we want to put assessments on using a building value residual as the basis of assessment. In order to determine land value, we want to do a land value residual. If we know the total property value, say 200,000, and if we're able to estimate the building value very accurately, 140,000, we'd then be able to show that the land value was 60,000 through a residual analysis. The other thing I wanted to talk about is tear downs, and Nick pointed this out pretty well, that you have to add on to a purchase price the cost of demolition. So a person buying a lot for 40,000, if the cost of demolishing it is 8,000, what they're paying is 48,000. That's the value of the land is 48,000. So that's important for consideration. Now I'm going to give two examples. The first one is a land subdivision development. And the question is, how much should be paid for a site that has 12.5 acres of vacant, undeveloped land on which could be built 50 home sites that could be sold for 50,000 each? Now, this is what builders do. Builders find a parcel of land. In this case, they found one for 12.5 acres, and they want to figure out how much is the maximum price that they could pay for this site and be in the business and make a profit of building homes. In essence, the land subdivision development is the procedure where we take the total value of the undeveloped land is estimated as though that land was subdivided, developed, and sold. And this is the method that is used by developers that contemplate building a subdivision of homes. Now, I've actually put in some examples from a project that I worked on years ago. And this shows all the costs that go into it. So in this case, the developer on this 12.5 acres is going to come up with 50 sites. That's quarter acre sites that he's going to be able to sell for $50,000 each. But it's going to take him 4 years to do this work. So he's discounting those values that he's going to, that 2.5 million that he's going to get in 4 years. Over that time, he's applying a 15% discount. He's going to have a cost, a subdivision cost. He's going to have to go through planning and so forth. We've estimated that at $50,000. Then there's going to be the development costs. That's taking the graders and grading the hills and coming up with the lots and putting in the site improvements, the streets, and other things that are required by the city in order to improve the site. And then he's going to have a cost of sales. He's figuring 10% of the gross selling price, which is $250,000. Then he's going to have taxes and interest and carrying costs. He's figuring that at 10% of his net value. That's $250,000. So when he comes down to the end, what he should pay today for something he's going to sell for $2.5 million in 4 years is $500,000, which is $10,000 per site. I point this out because oftentimes, as land value taxers, we don't really appreciate the amount of effort, the amount of cost that goes into making a site usable. So in this 12.5 acres, the person that is going to sell it is only going to get from a knowledgeable person $500,000 for this 12.5 acres, because they're going to have to spend $2 million over time in order to improve it and make it so that they can sell it to the public. The second example that I wanted to give is another example of developmental analysis. How much should be paid for a land site to build a 10,000 square foot office building? So on this, we want to consider what a hypothetical building would be. What kind of an office building, a 10,000 square foot office building would be. We estimate the net income, and then we capitalize it at 6%. And we determine the land value as a residual. So here's the calculation on it. You build the office building, and you're estimating that the rent per square foot from the finished building would be $24. You're having to look at vacancy over the life of the building, 50 years, as being worth $1. It may be vacant, maybe 3 or 4 years of that 50-year life. We look at the operating expenses, estimate $5. So that leaves a net income from the development of that artificial building of $18 a square foot, capitalized at 6%, that's $3 million. We know how much the building costs. It costs $2 million to build. So again, through a land residual, the difference between the net income value and the recapture of the building, 3 million, subtracting the building of 2 million, is 1 million being the land residual value. And that's what a developer would be willing to pay for that site. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is that at the session a week ago, I was asked about how we develop capitalization rates, and I thought I'd just show that. At the session, I pointed out that market value is estimated by dividing the net income by the capitalization rate. Well, the question came up with, well, how do you develop this capitalization rate? And it's very simple algebra. And this next chart shows it. And assessors, when they know 2 items in a 3-factor formula, can estimate the 3rd factor. For example, to estimate the market value, if they knew the income and they knew the capitalization rate, is simply dividing the income by the capitalization rate. If they didn't know the income, but they knew the market value and the capitalization rate, they could estimate the income. Or if they need a capitalization rate, they could develop that by dividing the income by the market value. And that's how we get our capitalization rates. And just to repeat what I said last time, a capitalization rate is different than an interest rate or an investment rate. It's a rate that's determined through market action, and it has to be developed based upon market evidence. So those are my comments, and I'd be glad to answer questions along with Nick.
Okay, let me kill the screen, and
I have a couple of comments on what Ted said, if I could.
sure.
One of the things is that it might not be clear that the idea of residual gets used in two different ways, and you have to keep them straight. If you have a piece of vacant land, you want to know what it would be worth. You do as Ted was doing. You imagine putting a building on it, and what you have left over after paying all the costs is the value of the land. That's land as residual. On the other hand, if you have a site that is developed and the building's been around a while, then it's important that you take the building as residual approach. You ask what the land is worth, doing a land as residual approach on an imaginary building, and then you say the existing building is worth what's the differences between the actual value and the land value calculated without regard to the building that's there. And I see Ted's head nodding. So it's important to keep those two ideas about residual straight. The other thing I wanted to say is that Ted's discussion of developing 12.5 acres into 50 home sites raises the very interesting question of what we mean by vacant land. Do we want to count all the things that the developer did in getting those sites ready for building homes on them? Do we want to call those improvements so that the unimproved value is the value of what the developer is selling? Or do we want to say that the unimproved value of the land is what it would be worth as a piece of land with no sidewalks, no streets, no sewers, no subdivision into separate lots? I don't know what the right answer to that question is. But if we're going to have a system of taxing land and land alone, we have to answer that question. And I wonder if Ted has any thoughts about that.
Yes. In essence, land value includes the site improvements that have been made to it. As assessors and as land value taxers, we're looking at land with the amenities that land brings to the user. And those include things such as the pavement in front of it, the highway in front of it, the social improvements that have been made, the fire stations and police stations, the fact that it has sewer and water and so forth. These are part of land value. And from a point of raising revenue from land value, it should include all of the improvements that have been put in. They included not only the social benefits, which we know are part of land value, such as police protection and education and so forth, but also includes the physical improvements that have been made. And I know I had to wrestle with this when I was first in the Georgist movement, because I thought, well, we only want to tax the vacant land value, the unimproved land value. But in essence, over time, all land has both physical and social amenities that accrue to it that become locked into the land value. And it's not something that we should or try to separate out. What we would wind up doing is saying, well, the schools are maybe worth a certain percentage and the water system is worth a certain percentage and so forth. And I would rather stay with simply what the land value as it exists today is worth, including all the social and physical amenities.
I think that you're right about what's practical, but what that brings to my mind is the possibility of having some kind of public subsidy for all these things. It seems to me that to be consistent with our principles, we might have to say that when these things are paid for privately, it's appropriate to subsidize them so that we are not taxing that component of human effort. But if, I don't know if you wanted to take that up or save that for some other time.
No, we'll save that because it's certainly true. Like if you're in a condominium or something, there are shared expenses. And if you send your child to a private school and you're not taking benefit of the public offerings. So these are questions that could be dealt with. I'd rather not deal with it right now, though. Let's go on with other things.
Yeah, I was thinking about it in terms of the disincentive to subdivide, that if the assessment is going to include, if we're going to tax the land on the value that is really the hidden infrastructure value that the developer pays, because it's I don't know about today, but my dad was a plumber when I was a kid. He was a new house plumbing contractor, and my understanding was that the developer paid for all the infrastructure, including building the streets up to municipal specifications. And then the municipality would assume the maintenance costs once he passed inspection. And that struck me as a major improvement that was wrapped up in land values. And I would think that if you wanted to do that, you would almost have to assess that separately and have it itemized separately, and it might not be worth it all. But the incentive to not assess or to not subdivide comes from, I think, the much higher assessment on a property that is subdivided, even over and above the infrastructure cost. There is an assessment bias in that you're selling parcels and you're assessed on the value per parcel, where the raw land was you were assessing by acre for the large land and you're assessing by parcel for the subdivided land.
So there are lots of interesting aspects of it. I think it's worth a panel sometime rather than a quick response.
Okay. Let's see. I have several questions. The majority of them come from Giannis. He wanted to know from Nick, on slide 9, isn't that a tax on buildings? And can you explain Rule 5 again?
I will have to go change my screen here and get back to that.
Okay. Ed Dodson, it occurred to Ed that that this scheme might work in a country where property is not currently appraised for purposes of obtaining mortgage financing. In the US, assessors have access to statistics on land values and building values on thousands and thousands of properties appraised during a sales transaction, as well as when an existing mortgage loan is refinanced. So that
just speaking about my experience in Greenwich recently, we of course had access not only to all the sales, but we had access to all kinds of information, and we would routinely do calculate a land residual on every improved sale, so that when we did our land analysis, which we did before we did the total property analysis, we'd always do the land first. We would have such a wealth of information about land sales and information about land that it was very easy to come up with the land values. And we were able to measure the differences, not only from one neighborhood to another, but from one property to another, based upon slopes and view and all kinds of things that you had this mammoth amount of information about that you could make adjustments for. And we wound up with land values that were, pretty pretty correct all the time. When we went to our court cases, we very seldom would ever have anyone raise a question about the land value. It was always the building value that they were concerned with. That's another reason, another advantage to a land value tax is that most all the questions that assessors get are not on land, but they're on buildings. And again, it will reduce the cost of assessment if you're only valuing land and not having to spend so much time on the buildings.
Okay, I have access to the slides again. Could you repeat Giannis's questions?
On slide 9, isn't that a tax on buildings? And
No, slide 9 is the first page of rules, and
okay,
it says decide on a tax rate, say 5% per month. It doesn't say what the base is. I should have said that the tax rate is going to be 5% per month on the value of land.
okay. And he wanted to explain Rule 5.
Okay. The administrator examines the offers of the owners and the demolition contractors. Whenever the value set by the owner plus the price for demolition is less than the offer by the developer, the administrator announces that the sales of the developer, with the owner and the developer splitting the profit. So the owner says, my property is worth $500,000. The demolition company says we could take it down for $50,000. That's $550,000. So if the developer is willing to pay $700,000 for it, well, then it's sold at a price of $625,000, halfway between the sum of the requirement of the owner plus the demolition cost and what is offered by the developer.
Yeah, it's one thing that occurred to me in all this is that this is fine for people who are all in the profession, all in the real estate game. I'm thinking of this in terms of the average residential homeowner who agonizes over just filling out his income tax return.
Yeah.
And
okay, that's why anybody who doesn't want to play doesn't have to play. He finds out what somebody's willing to pay for his house, and that determines the tax that he has to pay, and he has to accept the fact that his house is worth that much because he can sell it for that price if he wants to. And then he says, okay, that's what it's worth. Those are the taxes they have to pay. I'm not interested in playing the game, so I'm not going to.
Yeah. Another thing that occurred to me is we have a supermarket chain that dominates the market here, and what is to prevent somebody like that from seeing that in a particular neighborhood there's one other business that
yes,
that is competing with them, and if they overbid on that business, they can force that guy to sell.
Yeah, well, there are two possibilities. One is that you could have a Federal Trade Commission that prevents monopolization. The other is that the person who is bought out might just simply buy somebody else out, move his business to some other convenient place and continue to compete.
Okay. Ted, you seem to be, Giannis again, thought you were using numbers from the early 80s. Today's interest rates are close to zero. I don't know that that's true in terms of the interest that like I would have to pay to get a mortgage. It's probably the interest, the prime rate is close to zero.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting a mortgage at 3 3/8%. So they are pretty low. If you, so they're lower than they used to be. But with all the money that's going into the economy, I wouldn't be surprised if we have considerable inflation in a couple of years and interest rates go back up again.
The other thing to remember is that an interest rate has nothing to do with a capitalization rate. A capitalization rate is where you divide the income by the value. And if you look at capitalization rates today, they have not dropped down anywhere near interest rates or anywhere near mortgage rates. They're right around 6% right now. Some of them are lower. Maybe some of them are as low as 5. Some of them are higher. Some of them are 8. So, you know, what happens in terms of the Federal Reserve and setting interest rates has nothing to do with real estate. Real estate values are measured by real estate sales and by income in reality. And they vary quite a bit from what comes up in terms of news. Pay no attention to the news. That has nothing to do with real estate.
Okay, let me, this is kind of what I asked. Sue Hansel asked, Nick, does your model assume that an owner is always considering selling their property?
No.
No.
They can if they want to. If they feel that their property is overvalued, they can say it's not worth that much, and to prove it, I'm going to offer it for this lower price. But if they don't want to play that game, they just accept that it's worth what somebody says they're willing to pay for it.
John Beck said, Nick, when you say the developer reports a bid price function, can the developer use any functional form as long as it is continuous, or is some general functional form specified and the developer just specifies values for parameters of that function?
Well, it can't be too wild, or you'll have people artificially raising the value of highly developed properties. I'm not sure exactly how to control that. So you have to allow the function to be sufficiently flexible to take account of reality. And I would need to examine what happens in life before I would know exactly what kind of constraints to put on it to make sure that it was flexible enough, but not so flexible as to let people get away with taxing the buildings.
Okay. And Ed Dodson repeated his comment. He made it while you were searching through your slideshow, that your scheme would work in countries where property appraisals are not the norm for financing.
Well, I think that what I would agree with Ed on is that when you don't have property appraisals, it contributes more. If property changes hands frequently and there are lots of property appraisals, then there may be relatively little to be added to from a system of professional assessors.
Okay, and Giannis again is concerned that predatory rich bidders can artificially drive the tax bill of an owner up and then drive them out without being forced to put their money where their mouth is.
No, they have to put they have to be ready to buy at the price they offer. If they drive somebody's taxes up, the person whose taxes driven up said, agreed, give me the money and you can have the property. I'll go move next door or wherever.
Okay, and what's the penalty if they renege on that?
Well, they have to post a bond before they can be an assessor. And
okay.
This is not for fun and games. This is for keeps.
Okay. That's the question. I was anticipating this talk to be about somebody about the assessment data being publicly accessible, and so I was anticipating a different type of competition where people would do the assessing for the entire taxing jurisdiction, and the winner would be the person who came closest to pick
to matching
predicting the subsequent sales.
Yes, yes. I've thought about that kind of competitive assessment game also. That is an interesting possibility. And again, I don't think you would need to require people to assess the whole city, but in order to be eligible for a prize, they'd have to assess enough that you could get a good estimate of how accurate they were. So it's a bit of a trick to make that work.
Okay. Yeah, and I also thought about assessing the assessors, and that applies more to the conventional assessing.
Yes.
Which is, you have several stages in assessing. You have the data gatherer who puts the information into the computer assisted mass appraisal. Then you have the adjuster who says the mass appraisal needs to be tweaked for this property and that property and this other property. And, you know, there's several properties on a block that have a spectacular view of the city, but some of the properties are obstructed by properties across the street from them, and some of them are not. And so there's this, there are things that are too fine to be in the computer assisted system. So there are those people. And I thought at every step of the way, you could say, you know, was the data collected accurately? And the appeals process reveals that some people were accurate and some people were not. And then, does this computer program work better than that computer program? And when this assessor made special adjustments, did they improve the predictions or make them worse? And even up to the appeals process, all the way to common pleas court judges, that when this judge granted an assessment, did he actually improve the you know, this property subsequently sells? Did it sell for the appealed assessment, or did it sell for the original assessment? And that there be some kind of feedback so that we can evaluate the assessors.
This is a much different idea than mine, Dan. It's your idea. You can write it up and present it.
Okay.
You know, the real estate is quite different as an investment than stocks and other kinds of investments, because you're looking at a long-term period. Most real estate is not held for like months or even years. It's held for, much of it's held for a lifetime or the life of a business. So people are looking not at today, they're looking at today plus all the future years coming up. And they're thinking they're paying a price that represents not only today, but the future. And that's why real estate is so different than stock values and other values. Of course, when we have a major decline, we can see, you know, land values just drop enormously fast because things that happen that just cut out, you know, the expectations that people had. So real estate is quite different. It has to be thought of quite differently than stocks and bonds and other investments.
I guess this is Chuck Metalitz says, could Bill Gates decide to evict everybody from a neighborhood? And this is, I'm thinking a lot of poor neighborhoods have low values because there's a lot of poor people in them. And so if you could outbid them all, whether you only bid for assembly or not, if you outbid them all, can you
remove them all?
Remove them all.
I think that there's a variation in that question that I have thought about, and that is that when you think about the possibility of having to give up your property, you think differently if you can buy something else in the neighborhood than if you're going to have to move to the next town. So if there was a real possibility of somebody buying up the whole neighborhood and forcing everybody to move so far away that all their social connection would be broken, you might have to say that there were two prices for your property. One for a buyer who only wants to buy your property and you can move somewhere else in the neighborhood, and another higher price for somebody who wants to buy the whole neighborhood and force you to move to the next town. That those are two different kinds of value that you would reasonably have.
Okay.
There are some questions in chat, Dan, if you'll look at them. Three of them.
Bill Batt wants to know why it's necessary to have a fixed deadline during the bidding.
Well, I think that it's because a person who's thinking about the possibility of offering his property for sale might want to say, well, I don't want to think about selling all the time, but every now and then I can tell you what my property is worth. But if somebody doesn't want it, I don't want to have to face the uncertainty every single day. So I think that you owe it to people who aren't particularly interested in selling, but might sell at the right price, not to put them on the hook for being ready to move every single day.
Okay. Bill Batt says, can't a GIS triangulation and other regressions be used to come close to evaluating all the land sites in the city?
I don't know. I think that's an interesting empirical question.
That might be a TED question.
Yeah. So,
yeah, from my experience, we're able to do what's known as a multiple regression analysis, which is simply looking at all the data. And in terms of data, we may have a couple of thousand bits of data about every property, every land site, just details about it. And the multiple regression analysis weights all the characteristics that a site may have. Most of it is found in its location first, and second in its size. Those are the two biggest components of land value. And then after that, it's amenities and all the other things that happen, and distances to things such as train stations and so forth. Bill's using the term GIS. Yes, it's really multiple regression analysis expressed through a geographic system. And that is something that could allow updating of land as frequently as you wanted to. I would suggest that once a year would be ideal, that each year in June, before the tax bills go out in December or something, that all the land be updated through a regression and GIS type system. So the answer to Bill's question is yes, certainly it could be done. And the smarter jurisdictions that have the ability are doing it right now today.
I was wondering, do they examine interactions of variables? And what I'm thinking of is, like, in an upper middle class neighborhood, the added value of being near a park is tremendous. But in a very poor neighborhood, it can actually be, your land value can actually be lowered if you're near a park, because that's where the drug deals are going down and things like that. So you not only have to look at each variable, but you have to have, the computer has to pair variables and see how they interact with each other. And I assume they do that. I don't.
You're right. They definitely do that. And it's not put in like as it's put in multiple ways, and often variables interact with one another, so that you come up with some variables that are created themselves. They create new variables because they see the weighting that interactions have between multiple variables. So all of this is with computers today, you can come up with so much detail, so much analysis, and you can come up with very precise answers. It then becomes difficult for a taxpayer to fight their land value, because they don't have any, any idea of all the background information that the assessor has.
Let me see, we have, what if different players and communities have different perceptions of land value? For example, if police investment should be part of land value. I'm not sure.
Well, if different people have different ideas, the value put on it by the person who places the highest value on it.
Yeah, I think that question has more to do with assessing public policy, which Matt Harris claimed that he could use assessments to project the changes in land value if various public policies were implemented. So if you say, what will it do to land values if we widen this road, or what will it do to land values if we put in a playground or whatever? And there might be some of these that are not very location specific, but they will, it's the Stiglitz Henry George theorem that a good public policy should increase land value by more than its cost. That seems to be what ties in here. So he says, I was referring to Black Lives Matter. Yeah, that gets into different questions from assessing, taking public policy at whatever it is and assessing accordingly is kind of the focus we're on. But there is the question of making recommendations to the policymakers of, this is what we've learned about how public policy affects land value. So I hear Ted's birds.
Yes.
So I don't see any more questions. Do people have, oh, Giannis had a question on the depreciation, but it doesn't say what the question is. So does, oh, he had one that he thinks how can we connect building depreciation with realistic estimates of how much a building depreciates?
Well,
the current depreciation rates are way too high. Those are tax deduction rates. And last week, Ted said we depreciate buildings individually.
Instead of depreciation, we really need to talk about obsolescence.
Right.
When a building is ready to come down, it's worth zero or something negative, whether it's worn out or not. So instead of talking about depreciation, we should say, what's the land worth? What is the property worth? The difference is what the building's worth, and depreciation is defined implicitly in that way.
So depreciation is not the standard depreciation rate is not necessarily too high everywhere, because in some places the building depreciates very rapidly because the neighborhood changes rapidly.
Yes. We should not think of depreciation as something we can know by looking at the building. It's something that is determined by the environment in which the building sits.
Okay.
Yeah, there's functional obsolescence and physical obsolescence. There's all kinds of factors that go into depreciation, and using a building residual when you assess property basically is, if you have a good total value and a good land value, you put the building in as a residual, and that takes care of the depreciation. It takes care of everything. You don't have to have a depreciation rate. It's just, if you know the land value, which is pretty easy to do, and you know the total value, which is pretty easy to do, the building value is the residual, what's left. And that's what you put in, and you don't bother saying, well, this is due to physical depreciation or functional or economic or whatever. It's just in the building value as depreciated.
Okay. Ed Dodson wants to challenge you, Ted, on your comment regarding the effect of low mortgage rates on real estate prices. As rates fall, buyers can qualify for a higher loan, which contributes to a seller's market and higher prices asked for.
That's true.
Yeah, I'm not going to challenge Ed on that. He has the experience in the background, I think, and he's seen in his lifetime. And certainly we went through this, I think, before our last downturn in 2008, where there was a lot of people that were buying houses. I remember 2006 and 2007, people were buying houses with nothing down. They were getting big mortgages. The low income were qualifying and so forth. But it then finally reached a point where we had a crash, a major crash that impacted the real estate market for a long period of time. So I accept what Ed has said about that.
I guess my big question is, what are the costs of doing this as opposed to the costs of conventional assessing, in terms of, a lot of these costs are not budgeted, but there's all these people are calculating what offers they would make on properties, the most of which there will be no transaction. I'm wondering what the coast friction coefficient or whatever it is called.
Okay, what transactions cost? How do transactions cost figure in here? I've been thinking about that too, and I think what will happen is that there'll be a tendency toward underassessment. That the competitive assessors will say, now, it's not worth my time to figure out exactly what this property is worth, but I'm sure it's worth at least X, so I'll just put that down, and maybe I'll be the high bidder. So it will not be careful assessment. It will be the kind of assessment that people feel confident won't lose the money. So there'll be some general underassessment, and I don't know if it'll be biased against anybody. But that would be how I would expect transactions cost would figure in.
Okay. But where there's no actual transaction, but there's still the cost of estimating all these land values in the hope of a transaction. I'm just talking about the physical cost of doing that.
Yeah. Okay.
Homework.
So somebody says, if nobody else is doing it, I'll do it, and I'll do a quick and dirty job of it, and maybe I'll be the high bidder. So under assessment will be the safe thing to do. It doesn't cost much.
Okay. I guess that's it. Does anybody have any final thoughts?
Well, I'll make some general remarks, and that is that I think we all have an interest in raising more public revenue by collecting the rent of land. And I think that from a standpoint of assessment, it is totally feasible to collect all or as much of the revenue from land rent that is needed or that is desired. Certainly we have the mechanisms throughout the United States now to do this. There's many jurisdictions that do an excellent job of assessing, and there's many that with a little bit of additional effort could do a remarkable job. I think our real problem is that the public continues to accept lower and lower revenue from land assessment and more revenue from sales taxes and income taxes and other taxes on all kinds of things. And really, I think that we need to be looking at how we convince people that income taxes and sales taxes are regressive, and they're not the way to have a prosperous society, and that's what we have to address our attention. The assessment world, I think, can produce the result if the public wants it, and we need a public now that wants it.
Okay. You have anything else, Ted or Nick?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, well then, I'd like to thank both of you and point out once again, let me hit my screen share, and point out once again that that this was made possible by support from the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation primarily, and also the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth Sharing Associates, and private donors. Thank you, everybody.